We're looking at a second command found in the book of 1 John today, and we're going to move over to chapter 4 to find that. And this is a very direct command. Yesterday we saw that we're not to love the world, nor the things in the world. But in verse 7 of chapter 4, he does tell us to love something. He says to love one another. That's his command. Beloved, talking to believers, let us love one another. For love is from God, and everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. So we start with the command. Beloved, love one another. The New Testament is full of one another commands and commitments, how we are to treat one another and love one another and care for one another. These are typical commands. So we're to love one another. Don't love the world system. Don't love these things that are going to pass away, but we're to love one another. The great commandment, remember when Jesus was asked, what is the greatest of the commandments? And he said, summing up all the commandments, including the New Testament, you're to love God and you're to love one another. And so John is writing here about the same thing. Let us love one another. So if we are the child of God, if we are living for Him, if we serve Him, then it ought to be a natural thing for us to love one another, but it's also a command. So if we get off track and we get self-centered and we forget about one another, we're reminded here that we are to love one another. For love is from God. So the root of all love comes from God. It stems from God. And everyone who loves has been born of God and knows Him. So love is a natural component of being a child of God. Those that do not know God do not have this kind of love. They can love. We know that. We know that parents love their children. We know there's love between husband and wife. We know people love one another. But there's a special love for the brethren, for the people of God, the special, unique love that God gives the children of God, and it's part of who we are. It's part of our spiritual DNA. Verse 8, the one who does not love does not know God, because God is love. So if you claim to be a child of God, but you don't love, then there's something out of sync between you and God, because God, by His very essence, is love. His very nature is love. And so to be a child of God, one born again by God, and yet not love others is a serious disconnect that ought to cause us to think seriously about our walk with Him, and perhaps in some cases even our salvation. Verse 9, by this the love of God has manifested in us, that God has sent His only begotten Son into the world so that we might live through Him. So he's saying here now, I'm going to give you the perfect example of love. You want to see love? Here it is. God sent His Son to love to this earth because God so loved the world. And Christ came for us because He loves us. So if you want to see the perfect manifestation, the perfect example of love, you look no further than God sending His Son in the incarnation and ultimately the cross and the resurrection and eventually coming back for us. You need to look no further than that. That is the perfect epitome, the perfect example of all love. So He tells us, let's take a good look at that. Look at what God has done for us. And then He says in verse 10, and this is love, not that we have loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be a propitiation for our sins. So He continues on. This is love. We don't start out loving Him. He doesn't love us because we love Him. We didn't initiate this thing. God initiated His love for us. We are responding to that love. And He sent His only begotten Son. That's the incarnation. Why? Well, we've already seen He comes to save us from our sins. But here is something else that we often don't think about. He came to be a propitiation for our sins. That word propitiation is the idea of satisfying the righteous anger and righteous judgment of God. And so Christ came not only to save us, but also to fulfill the requirement of a righteous God for sins to be dealt with. God, being who He is, simply cannot overlook sin. Something had to be dealt with. Something had to deal with those sins, and that was Jesus Christ Himself, who came to satisfy the righteous judgment of God against sin. Why would God do that? only because of his great love for us. So there's our example, and there's what God has called us to be, those who love one another. We'll look at one more commandment in First John tomorrow before we complete this little book.